Now I'm gonna take a bit of a darker tone on the lemon. This is kind of my, I guess the mid shadow tone, and going right underneath here. I don't want that to be, like I said, a hard edge. So what do I do about this edge? Good question. So that's probably where you want to squeeze the paint off the brush just so you have a little bit of a wet brush. Take that brush and just soften that edge a bit. I wouldn't go too far. Part of what's key about doing that is doing it not messing around too much. If I do a whole lot of that, you're going to end up with a messy edge. It's overworked and and so on. It kind of drags up a little bit here. So I could drop a little bit of paint in, let this area right kind of on the point of the lemon, let that merge a little. Again, don't overwork it. I have to say that to myself sometimes. Don't overwork it, Stuart. Right? Right. What I'm doing at this point is wet on dry. So I'm going to take this same tone, go back further. I'm looking for basically everywhere I see the core of the shadow. And I'm going to work back with that. Again, if you need to, you can kind of soften the edges as you go along. But I can definitely see the core of the shadow pretty much moving just like this. Moves across a little bit. There's some striations, right? Now at this point that looks a little clumsy, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to take, I have kind of a transition tone here, which is really the lightest part of the shadow. It's dull, but not too much duller. And I'm going to work in, especially around here, the lighter part of the shadow, with that slightly lighter tone. Again, lemon kind of has its bumpiness, its variation in the surface. I wouldn't get too hung up on that, and hung up meaning don't spend too much time on the texture, the more minute qualities of the surface. We're going to get to that. But unless you're practicing watercolor and you kind of know what you're doing at this point, and you want to go a little bit further, fine. Now, down here, as you can see, I put another layer down. Still feels like a hard edge. So I'm going to go in again with my darkest dark, which is this kind of muddy green. You know, some people would push this to a more of a green so that it had a little bit more color to it. What I want to do, especially right here, right there, I want to get rid of that edge. I want to obliterate it. I want to like not show that edge at all. I just went over that one too many times. So yeah, I want to get rid of that edge. Want the other side of the shadow that's on the lemon, not the edge, to soften a little bit. But I really want that to blend right into the shadow. And one of the things that you can do there is let the watercolor kind of do that for you a little bit by taking a little bit of my shadow on the cloth, going right up against there, and let's get a little bit more paint on there. This might work a little bit better actually. I'm gonna actually let them run into each other on purpose. You know? Kind of lose that edge on purpose. Spread it out. Right? Right? See what I mean? Yeah. And we want to try and do the same thing over here with the grapefruit. So the lemon's getting there, you know? Alright. So let's go over to the grapefruit. Look at kind of deepening some of the shadows. Same way. Now, what I have on the palette is, this would kind of be the lighter part of the shadow, maybe the core of the shadow, and the darkest part of the shadow. They do get cooler, but to a limited amount, because this is such a warm object, an orange red, kind of difficult. So I might start with the core of the shadow, and again start at the bottom here. This is where I want to create kind of a loss of an edge. I'm going to follow the core of the shadow, let some reflected light stay in here, but I'm going to follow the core of the shadow up this way. Might need a little bit more water to keep that going. And again, on the other side, probably can use a wet brush or use this lighter tone right here. I'm going to come out a little bit further on top here. Okay. Now, kind of while it's still wet, we'll go into this lighter part of the shadow that I have mixed, and kind of drag that shadow out. You can see that edge is starting to dry already. You probably want to do this while that edge is still wet. So I'll work rather quickly to move around, kind of get that edge. And at this point, I might go back to the core of the shadow, lay some more paint down. let that that area get a little bit deeper, right? Okay. Where I have my lighter areas, I might, you know, looking at this, kind of how washed out some areas look, I'm gonna put down a little bit more of my most saturated paint here. And probably here. I'm ignoring some details on the grapefruit for the sake of making this a little bit simpler. That's artistic license, of course. Or most of my light's coming from this direction, so, you know, that will kind of be reflected in where you're seeing the strongest color. Got a bit more of it through here. We'll go a little bit lighter. Put some more paint down through some of the lightest part there. Okay. And now as I work around those highlights, I got more water on my brush than anything. I'm gonna squeeze that off. Let's put a little bit more paint in here. Now let's go back down here. I'm gonna put some more of the again, this is a pretty dark in terms of this object. I'm gonna put more of it down on the bottom, a little bit more even on the top. Okay, and then, you know, through the middle here, we got a little bit of reflected light. I don't want to overdo that, and I'm going to need to kind of drag it out a little bit on this side, so I don't have too hard of an edge. Just a wet brush going along that edge. If you need to, you know, if you feel like an edge is getting too hard, just kind of go along with a wet brush or some lighter paint that creates more of a transition. Just again, like I've said so many times, don't kind of overdo the brushwork. You know, and it's okay if your brush strokes show. That's not what I'm saying. If your brush strokes show, it should be pretty direct, pretty assertive, and you don't want to look like you're being indecisive and taking, you know, 100 little brush strokes to do, you know, what could be a fairly simple thing. Be assertive, you know, put your marks down. Even if you feel like you're not sure about a mark, you're not sure if what you're doing is right, you kind of still got to try and operate that way. So let's look at the bottom here. And again, just like I did last time with the lemon, we're kind of going to do the same thing here. Put a dark right underneath of it. It's okay if they bleed together a little bit. I might need to put a little bit more of a shadow. Again, you may need to, in your own still life, you may need to kind of put a shadow where it doesn't exist, if you really don't see one, on the bottom of the object. You need to kind of disrupt that edge right here. We need to disrupt that edge. And no matter what you have to work with in terms of what you're seeing, that concept of disrupting the bottom edge, breaking the bottom edge, gets the object to sit on the surface. That's just kind of a reality of making a painting of an object. Making a painting of an object sitting on the surface, as opposed to making a painting of an object that's floating in the air. If you want to make a painting of an object that's floating in the air, that's easy. Just, don't do anything with that bottom edge and it'll float. Another thing I want to look at here is where these two objects overlap and what object is going to come forward. Here you have a relatively light area, kind of mid-value, or light shadow maybe, but a pretty strong color area, and here's shadow. But right now, in terms of value, they're not that far apart. And so this edge doesn't really assert itself, doesn't really go back. What's the best choice? Well, since this edge is really kind of in front of the lemon slightly, I'm going to paint it that way. Which means going back into the lemon and kind of reinforcing that dark right where we need it. So I'm going to go in right here. And this is the opposite of what I just did. What did I just do? I just kind of softened an edge. Made an edge sit back. The two sides of the edge very close to each other, or kind of intermingling the value and the color so that the edge doesn't show up very much, if at all. Here I'm doing the opposite. I'm going to take some dark paint. But also, like I mentioned earlier, they kind of happen to be complements, which sometimes can be nice because it gives you a little bit more pop. I'm going to sit a lot of that paint right on that edge, and that edge is going to pop a little bit more. So, I'll do that, and as I'm looking at this lemon, I'm looking at really the darkest part of the shadow, and it does kind of lay along these lines. Comes right down here, runs along there. So, there you go, really. What do I have to do? I'm going to take a wet brush in this case. I don't know if I'm going to drag it out with more shadow. Well, actually, I probably could. Let's drag it out with a little bit more shadow. Just a little bit lighter paint now. A little bit lighter. Right? Kind of what we already have, just dragging it out a little bit more. I want to leave some reflected light right here, reflected light, right? Leave some reflected light right there, and you can kind of drag this out a little bit with a lighter tone. Especially as we go kind of towards the back of that object. We have a really dark back there as well. If you feel like you need to just soften edges, like I said, do it simply. I mean, I have a pretty light touch, so a lot of what I'm doing doesn't really show up. On the other hand, if you do too much of what I'm doing, it is going to show up. Just saying. So, again, I want to feature this reflected light a little bit more. So I'm going to follow this down here, reinforce my shadow here a little bit. Again, right now I just have a wet brush. I'm dragging this a little bit. I want to keep it simple. Let the reflected light, just a wet brush here. I'm picking the paint up, kind of moving it over a little bit. Take it down to that shadow, and you can see that reflected light now a little bit better. Right? Yeah. Same thing here, it's over here a little bit. So I can take my brush, kind of do the same thing. If there's anything that's still maybe a little wet, you'll pick it up and move it. But I would just caution you, really, doing that, you know, going over an area like I just did with a wet brush, very easy to overwork if you start doing too much of that. Really, very easy. So be careful with that. Try and keep it as simple as you can. Here I'm going to go back into this part to kind of match the darks that I just put down. We need a little bit of a stronger tone around the top too, just to kind of be consistent with what I'm doing. And now maybe we'll use a little bit of just a real saturated yellow mixed with my lightest shadow. Give it more of a transition right here. Right? And we don't want to dirty everything up. By that I mean, you know, dirty everything up, and just mean we don't want to take duller tones and kind of end up putting them everywhere and covering up where we have our most saturated color. So be careful. I shouldn't say be careful too much. Don't be careful. Take chances. One of the other things that we need to look at is our edges all the way around. I've strengthened some of the darks, some of the really saturated areas. Now I got to look at both objects, and particularly the grapefruit. I've got pretty hard edges all the way around, except for this spot. And again, that edge, the outline of the object, that's a very two-dimensional aspect of the object. Like, imagine that outline just filled with a solid color. It's very flat, you know. Here on the lemon, It's not quite as two-dimensional because we've got kind of soft area here, soft area there, you know, and there's that hard and soft edge, and you really have to alternate between both, because remember, your edge has to do really two contradictory things. It has to be soft, make it look like it's going back into space, and it has to be hard in some places so that it really asserts itself and looks like it's in front of what's behind it. So here, particularly on the grapefruit, there's some places that we're going to need to soften. There's a couple of things I want to mention at this point. Working with edges. Once I get to this point and I'm going to soften some edges, one of the things worth mentioning is this brush I'm using right now. This brush is a fairly soft brush. It absorbs water really well, holds paint. But, you know, doing edges, I might want a little bit more of a stiffer brush. A little bit more of a stiffer synthetic brush. You know, this is a liner, what they call a liner. It's a rather short one, but it'll probably work pretty well. And the synthetic, slightly stiffer fibers are a little bit better for the kind of thing that we're going to do. What I want to do is soften some places. Again, the lemon, less of an issue. I got kind of a soft transition here, all through here. So it functions pretty well. I'm going to soften it a little bit more, but the grapefruit is a little bit more of a harder edge all around. So what do? Do you take gray and pull it in there? Do you take... hard to say. In some cases, all you need to do is go over an edge, you know, here, where you have a very light gray behind it. It might serve you best to just go over an edge with a wet brush and just kind of try and drag a little bit of that paint out so it's a little bit softer. You know, right now it's a little bit softer already. So I'm just gonna rework that edge. Remember, what's key is kind of the efficiency of your mechanics. If you do too much, it's gonna show. So I'm gonna do the same thing here. Drag that out a little bit, make it a little bit softer, you know, especially that back edge, because it's, again, it's the far edge of the object. You want to kind of look like it's going back. Here, there's more of a natural soft edge, so I might leave that alone. Here, that reflected light is kind of nice on that spot. You lose the edge here, you kind of lose the edge up to there. Boom, we're done. Now, the grapefruit, a little bit more of an issue because you have so many places. And here we have kind of a red against a blue. Yeah, you know, in some cases you can take some paint that's in between the two, you know, and try going over that edge. A lot of times it's not going to work too well, but sometimes it will. So let's see what happens if we take a little bit of this paint, you know. This is my darkest paint there. I'm going to mix it in with some gray. make it a little bit more neutral, okay, here. And then I'm just going to go over that edge, kind of something that's, you know, in between the two, right? Then I'll take all the paint off, go over that paint, and maybe soften it again. Okay? So you might still end up with a little tiny bit of an edge. If you probably wouldn't doing the same thing on cold press. I'm working on hot press. Hot press shows everything that you do. So yeah, you could end up with a little bit of an edge. It's not a big deal. It's watercolor. That happens. So let's say I want to continue to do that. Here, I want to be careful how dark it is because I got a lighter background. And I'm just going to take a wet brush after that and let that kind of dissipate. But again, you can drop some more paint in. This part of the edge already did have some softness to it, but we're going to go a little bit further, make it a little bit softer. And then here, you know, it does kind of have a dark hard edge right here, so I'm just taking a wet brush at this point. And keep in mind, don't let that brush get dry, because if you're just going over an edge with a dry brush and the paint is just a little bit wet, you're going to get a different effect. And it's just going to look like a whole bunch of scratching. I personally have overworked many an edge. You know, I pay a lot of attention to the edges, sometimes too much. And, you know, again, can't emphasize enough, you have to try and do things with an efficiency of effort. I'm just kind of going over all my edges. I might, again, that's a harder edge. I still might smooth it out. I could leave these edges pretty hard, but even in these cases, you might need to go over your edge, smooth it. You know, a lot of people, the way that they work with watercolor, though, that's never going to happen. I mean, they're not going to pay that kind of attention to edges. I say it as kind of an option, and it really depends on how you paint also. I mean, if you paint in a way where you're very direct and maybe, you know, you obliterate an edge while you're painting by putting down a dark here and a dark behind it, that's another way of doing the same thing. Just directly putting down a dark where it needs it on the object, and then putting down a dark on the background right next to it. That, again, is just as effective, particularly if your style isn't the same as mine, you know. And this is kind of where I hang out, but you really need to find what's comfortable for you. And particularly if you have experience painting, or you just kind of, you know, can get yourself to take more risks, I encourage you to be even more direct than I'm being. And you can paint more quickly in that way also. I'm not saying it's easier by any means, but it depends on how you're oriented. Let me show you one more thing because, I hesitate to show this to you. Maybe I shouldn't. Okay, I will. You can do a little bit of picking up paint. You know, if it's still like you did it recently within the past half an hour, or, you know, it's still a little wet, you can take a wet brush, have a paper towel handy, but you can take a wet brush, let's say, go over an area like this here, with just water, alright? Again, don't do a million brush strokes over it, you know, and then just press your paper towel down. Don't move your paper towel around. Press it hard, pick it up. You pick up some paint, you know. So if I wanted to say lighten up an area, and I did, I just put some extra paint down so I could show this to you and pick some of it up. You won't pick all of it up, but you know, you'll get a little bit of a tint of what was there, and you will pick up some of what you put down. That's real easy again to get, you know, an overworked look doing this kind of thing. I wouldn't say this is kind of like a method you should plan, but you never know when you might need it. And if I continue to put down water and do this, you have to be careful, you know, what you're doing to the surface, what it looks like. Good paper can hold up to this though. And you can see I am picking up paint, you know. Just if you have to lighten an area and you're talking about something that's fairly subtle, where you just put some paint down and you would pick some of it up, just keep in mind that if you did details in any area and you don't want to lose them, I wouldn't do this in that area, because, you know, you can lose other things that you put down. Alright? Be careful. Alright, so I'm okay with this for where it is. And one of the things I said we'd talk about is foreground, you know, middle ground, background. Increasingly, we are going to talk about that. The foreground might be someplace that, like, if you want to pull out some details in the drapery, do it there. Don't do it in the background. The foreground is closer to the viewer. It makes sense when you're building an illusion of space that the foreground might have more activity, more detail, and so on. The objects go along with that. Middle ground, again, it might be a transition area. Mainly here, it's our objects. And then as you get into the background, as I first said, I really tried to keep that simple. I put down some paint to keep those edges soft. You want that to sit back. So, you know, as a whole, this is fine. If I were going to do anything else to it, you know, in relation to this project, I might pull out a little bit more detail in the drapery up here, but it's not at all necessary for all of you to worry about that. Okay? Thumbs up.